The Ruger LCR and 22 long rifle is a nice little pistol. However, it suffers from a common problem with rimfire double-action revolvers: a heavy trigger. The trigger pull here was somewhere north of the 15-pound limit of my gauge. Hi, I'm Jim Humphrey with Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training, and today I'm going to tear down the LCR and lighten up the mainspring just a little. This is not something you should do. The process will weaken the spring, which will reduce its durability, probably cause malfunctions with some ammunition, and arguably affect the safety and warranty of the pistol. The engineers at Ruger chose this mainspring for sound engineering reasons, and anybody else would be foolish to second guess them. But for entertainment purposes only, let me show you what I did. As always, ensure the pistol is unloaded and remove all live ammunition from the work area. The grip removes with a single screw and simply slides off. The hammer strut has a small hole near the end. By slightly pulling the trigger to partly compress the mainspring, the hole is exposed, and the spring can be retained by a 3/64 inch brass rod. This will hold the mainspring in compression and take the force off the hammer. The crane pivot pin holds the crane to the frame, but it also holds the two halves of the frame together. The same driver removes the crane pivot pin. With the pivot pin removed, the crane and cylinder can be removed. At this point, I'm applying some pressure to hold the two halves of the frame together against the spring force of the trigger. At first, I only separated the frame far enough to gain access to the cylinder latch pin. With the cylinder latch pin removed, the two halves of the frame will separate. The cylinder latch is removed along with a very small cylinder latch spring. The cylinder latch spring fits into the cylinder latch. The trigger pin is easily pressed out, and the trigger components are removed. The trigger spring bushing is a small, agile part that is hard to see until all the parts hit the table. Keep track of it. The hammer is retained by the hammer pivot pin and is easy to remove because the mainspring is held in compression by that brass rod. The hammer strut pin presses out easily as well. In order to remove the hammer strut and mainspring from the frame, I have to trim off the brass rod so the assembly will pull through the frame. The mainspring is removed from the strut by holding the strut in a soft-jawed vise and grabbing the mainspring seat with smooth-jawed pliers. Then compressing the mainspring and removing the brass rod. Then carefully releasing the spring pressure. The perils of doing this should be obvious, but I was certainly careful to wear my safety glasses and keep away from the possible trajectory of that mainspring seat if it were to slip out of my pliers. To reduce the strength of the mainspring, I'm going to sand a little material off the entire length of the spring. In order to measure the amount of change, I checked the weight of the spring, and in total I removed about 2.5 grains. I removed the material in very small steps, testing the pull along the way. This process is going to weaken the spring, probably causing it to break prematurely sometime in the future. However, it did reduce the trigger pull to about 11.5 pounds. To reassemble the spring group, I reversed the very dangerous process of installing that mainspring seat. Again, I was very careful not to lean over that spring. Notice the mainspring seat has two flat sides, which have to be aligned with the flat on the other end of the strut, which is easy enough to do just by giving it a twist. The reassembly of the hammer group is just the reverse of the disassembly. The trigger group is not as complex as it looks. The pawl fits on the right side of the trigger. The trigger spring and bushing drop into the middle of the trigger, with the long leg of the spring to the back, less the lint, of course. The transfer bar fits onto the post on the left side of the trigger and sits behind the pawl. The installation starts with the trigger. Then with the spring and bushing, then the pawl. At this point, the trigger pin is installed. Double checking that the long arm of the trigger spring is to the back, the trigger can be rotated enough for the transfer bar to install. Finally, the cylinder latch and spring can be pinned in place. A little pressure on the latch will help line up the holes. One final check of the position and alignment of the trigger spring, pawl, transfer bar, hammer, and cylinder latch. The upper frame slides on from the front and is held in place with a little pressure. The cylinder and crane slide into position, and the cylinder pivot pin holds the assembly in place. A little tension on the trigger will make it easy to remove the pin that's holding the mainspring. Excessive dry firing of rimfires should only be done using dummy ammo. Install the grip and perform a function check.
All right, we got the LCR 22 out at the range. Do a little reliability check on that mainspring adjustment we made. Let's see how she runs. No misfires. I'm really happy with that result. Well, I'm Jim Humphrey from Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. Remember, enjoy your firearms, join the NRA, and be safe out there. Thanks.